Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf, and I'm joined today by Dr. Charles Keckler, who's the director of Northeastern University's Doctor of Law and Policy program and a professor of the practice. He has held senior roles in the federal executive branch across 3 presidential administrations, including leading the Regulatory Reform Task Force at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Twice confirmed by the Senate to lead the Legal Services Corporation, he supported civil legal aid for low-income Americans. Charles has taught at Penn State, George Mason, Harvard, the University of Michigan, and other prestigious universities. Before starting a career in academia and public service, he practiced trial and appellate litigation at one of Chicago's largest law firms. He holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University and an MA in JD from the University of Michigan, as well as an AB from Harvard College, where he graduated magna cum laude. He's also the co-author of a new booklet out with the Pioneer Institute for Public Policy Research called Restoring the Republic, a Blueprint for Constitutional Administration. And we talk about regulatory reform within the executive branch and what Congress can also do to more properly reshape the balance of power between the 3 branches, and then also between the federal, state, and even individual levels of liberty and governance. It's always great to take a look under the hood of our government, and this was a very interesting conversation towards that end, so we hope you enjoy.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Well, Charles Keckler, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Excited to be chatting with you today, especially now that we're in this new golden age of America. Tell me, just first impressions, what did you think of that inaugural address? That's always something I thought about. I wasn't sure how he would approach it, but what were your impressions?
Well, I compare it naturally to the first inaugural address that President Trump had in 2017. And I think that it struck a more optimistic tone in a lot of ways. On the one hand, he's certainly reacting against this sort of interregnum of the Biden administration and planning to reverse a lot of those items. And he sort of declares that openly, and that I think is no surprise. But I think he's looking forward in general to continuing a lot of the projects and ideas that were percolating within the first Trump administration. And so I think in that sense, it had a more positive agenda.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. Yeah, I agree. It was at once much darker than I thought an inaugural address was. He just said very candidly, here's where we are. And here's the message that I ran on of America as a failing nation, and here's this golden age that we're going to usher in. So it was like an inaugural address and a State of the Union and a campaign rally, all kind of like wrapped up into one. But one of those things that is very important to both the first administration and then subsequently the campaign and the message was dealing with the administrative state, and that gets us to this booklet that you co-authored, published by the Pioneer Institute, about restoring the republic and reforming administrative reform. And we've had a lot of guests up in the run-up to the podcast, or run-up to the election on this podcast, talking about what the agenda should be, like what he should do once he gets into the office. And you're the first that we've had now that he's in office. Mm-hmm. So what's the sort of the main thrust of this proposal or agenda that you and your co-authors wrote about?
Right. Well, and I would add, in addition to my 2 co-authors, this is the product of a workshop which was over the course of more than a year, with several contributors that are listed in there that have developed these ideas. And what we sought to do, I think, at the highest level, is to look at federal agencies and the way they operate, and in particular the executive branch as implemented through the federal agencies, and try to come up with some practical but also principled reforms that can realign it with the Constitution as written, and more broadly with constitutional principles like separation of powers and federalism. And I think one of the things that's implicit in our approach is that it rejects, although we don't get that explicitly in there, we focus on the reforms, but implicitly, this idea that has been pushed forward for many years, probably more than a century since the progressive era, that you have to make this trade-off, that you could have a modern, efficient, administrative state that produces, economic goods and welfare, or you could stick to the old Constitution. And so that at the best, the American people are confronted with this trade-off: stick to constitutional principles and sacrifice some advantages of modernity and efficiency. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think a lot of these principles, constitutional principles, and the founders' ideas were pretty sophisticated about making sure that one part of government doesn't get too big, that the government is balancing each other to allow the people to enjoy their liberty without that much interference, and that will produce prosperity. So I don't think there is that trade-off in the way that I think a lot of people suggest. And running through our report or booklet is this idea that they're realigning with the constitutional principles is going to increase citizen engagement. It's going to bring the government closer to the people, and it's also going to be advantageous for economic prosperity.
Hey there, listener. I'm just butting in to say that the Honors Conference application deadline has been extended to February 13th. So the Honors Conference will take place at August 3rd through 9th in Wilmington, Delaware, and it's our top program for undergraduates. So if you are a smart, thoughtful, conservative undergraduate student who likes to read and think and wants to meet impressive professors and be mentored by them and other intelligent, like-minded conservative students and spend a week here at ISI, apply for the Honors Conference at isi.org/events. Find the Honors Conference. The deadline has been extended to February 13th. Get your application in, and we look forward to seeing you. Now, back to the video. Well, those are all good things and things that we would want, and I definitely agree with this. It's a false choice that has been laid out. But before we sort of dive into in greater detail some of the more concrete proposals and how they fit or what changes they'd be making, I'm curious about the first 100 days of a presidential administration. Why is that so important? Because it occurs to me that, the president has at least 2 years, or has 2 years before midterms, when usually the electorate swings back in favor of the opposition for various reasons: off-ballot electorate, an engaged, emboldened opposition, things of that sort. But why is the first 100 days so critical? Because that's a big part of the booklet as well.
Right. Well, we phrase that a number of reforms for the executive branch and executive orders within that 100-day format. And in many ways, we're actually following on that sort of 100 days idea, which I think historically derives from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first 100 days. And the people are going to talk continuously about President Trump and how many executive orders he produced, but I don't think he's probably going to match what FDR did, which is over 500 orders in his first year, really trying to seize control in a way was pretty remarkable. Now, I think that, so in some ways that's historically based, the idea of just 100 days, and over the course, as you say, of the up to the run up to the midterms, there will be some latitude. However, it is important to get things done early. There's some technical things that you actually probably do need to get done within the first 100 days, which is Congress reviewing some of the regulations passed at the end of the Biden administration. That's a very time-sensitive activity. Moreover, not just per se the first 100 days, but certainly this sort of first 6 months within this first calendar year is very important, because Congress, once the clock turns around to 2026, and we're less than 12 months from there, 11 months left, as we're recording this, the Congress is going to start to think about election, particularly in the House, and re-election, and they're going to be focused on campaigning. and the ability to do legislating, the ability to make the fundamental change, to concentrate, to think deeply, to make structural changes, to, for instance, to put institutionalize and turn into legislative items, executive initiatives that the president has put forward is going to be limited. So if they're going to do that, if what they're one of the main things that we're going to see here is, and we in the booklet we kind of structure it this way, that the legislature will be able to take some things that the executive does and turn it into law. If that's going to happen, he needs to put those out on the table. Those need to be there. We need to start seeing how they're working as executive actions, and within the executive branch, we need to start vetting those and thinking about those before they get then turned into a legislative agenda, which hopefully will be able to be accomplished before the mind of Congress turns to their own seats next year. And so it is critical these first early months.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a helpful explanation because yeah, I guess it is the 2-year window, but when you have 430, was it 435 congressmen and women running around trying to get reelected, that does distract from the priorities. And so yeah, and of course it makes sense. One of the things that is a focus of the booklet is this idea, and I've never heard of this before, the Presidential Management Authority. And you want to bring that back, if I understand. What is it, and where does it come from, and why does it need to come back? Like, where did it go? Who removed it? Things like that. Tell us about
Yeah.
that presidential
Yeah,
management.
so it's a collection of different items, and some of the items that we recommend in there um, are actually being brought back. Some of them were in existence as executive orders, and those executive orders are being restored, and they involve the president is certainly as the head of the executive branch is certainly the CEO of the executive branch, chief executive officer, and is going to be able to set sort of policy. He is the employer or the primary representative of the people as the employer of members of the executive branch. And so we look to a lot of the ways that the Biden administration, for reasons that were no secret to anyone, was generally very favorable to unions, and was very willing to sort of allow the terms and conditions under which executive branch employees work for us, the people, to be set by the unions and the union rules and union structures. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about in the in the report. Yeah, and then there's other elements that we see sort of in the press as we're speaking today about structuring the rules about remote work, for instance. When I left the administration at the beginning of 2021, January 20th, 2021, at the end of the Trump administration, we had not gone back to work because it was the middle of the pandemic. We had sought to return people to work, but there were a number of objections, but I, firmly, expected that people would gradually return to work. But, here we are 4 years later, and most employees have not returned to in-office work. And that's because they prefer not to do it. The commutes are long and so on, and they were very accommodating. But if you have a strong belief, for instance, that in-person work is the most effective way, and that it's a good message, it has a practical value, and it's sort of a good message to the taxpayer that you're there, you're working, we can see you working there. That's part of this asserting that authority. And so we talk about some reforms in there, and the president is pursuing some other ones.
Yeah, does this relate to like the hiring freeze and some of these proposals that I've heard, just more vaguely, about, the president is trying to buy out all of the federal employees, or even the blanket power of the president to hire and fire anyone in the executive office?
Yeah, so that's a sort of a broader issue about hiring people. There are a variety of sort of including statutory rules that put limitations on that. But what the president is doing is thinking about workforce management. How many employees do we, the people, need? Does he need to run the executive branch? And that's what he should be thinking about. Are those things broadly? Now, the different sort of mechanisms that he's proposed, I think they call it the buyout. Sometimes it's called what's going on is a deferred resignation, in which people would resign ahead of time. I don't know how many people will do that. I think, and this goes beyond the report. Ultimately, what's going to be needed is a plan of hiring and bringing in the right people into the federal government and looking at hiring rules that get people that we actually need with needed skills, with abilities. The president has spoken about restoring meritocratic principles broadly in our society. I think the federal government would be a great place to start. Nominally, it's based around that, but I think a lot of the hiring rules could be reformed with that in mind. And so it's one thing to have a hiring freeze, okay, but management means, of course, bringing in people as well as letting people go and finding the right people. And so hopefully that will be the next phase.
Excellent. Well, we don't have a ton of time, so I want to keep moving and talk about some of these constitutional principles that we're going to reinfuse into administration. And one of those is separation of powers. Specifically, what the proposal that I read was that you want to take the major questions doctrine and apply it into the administrative state. Could you explain how that would be inserted into the regulatory apparatus and how that would solve some problems?
Okay, so let's start a little bit with what the major questions doctrine is, and that's a relatively recent doctrine, but based on very long-standing principles that the Supreme Court has articulated that regulations that are the product of statutes should not resolve in a new way, should not create sort of new novel authorities that solve major questions of sort of economic and political and social significance on their own. That when that authority was not clearly delegated to them by the statute by Congress, the people's elected representatives. And so that sort of restriction on regulation making by the executive branch is one that we think should be institutionalized in a number of ways. On the executive side, we think that the executive branch should start screening its regulations for, is there really a statutory authority? Are you trying to address questions that really should be left to Congress? Each agency, before it clears regulations, before it authorizes them, before it puts them out into the world, should be screening for that kind of authority using these legal doctrines that are now good law by the Supreme Court. And then, as an additional layer, the President's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is the body at the central body that reviews regulations. It should build up institutional capacity to make sure that the agency got it right. And then we also think that Congress, because ultimately this is on Congress, this is about congressional authority and making sure that Congress is exerting its authority over lawmaking as opposed to a federal agency, which isn't supposed to be doing lawmaking, it's supposed to be implementing. Congress should also build up its institutional capacity to look at regulations before they're put out there as law upon the American people and review regulations and have perhaps a congressional regulatory office or some other institution that can look at pending regulations and weigh in on them and saying effectively, no, we didn't mean that. We didn't mean to give you that authority. And so I think putting that on different layers and in different ways is a great implementation of the Supreme Court's, I think, correct decision in the major questions cases.
That's very interesting. And, forgive my ignorance, but does Congress not review administrative regulations already?
So that is not the general practice. So they will review them after they are they have a congressional review statute such that they have a chance to weigh in upon them after they're produced. That it because regulations are normally made public for a comment period, Congress can become aware of them and so forth. But the institutional generally these are operated largely separately. So Congress may in fact ultimately weigh in on regulations when they're pending, or individual Congress members may do that. But there's not really a body in there that is which was required to have a layer of review in which the White House would send over its regulations, say, well, what do you think? That's not a formalized process.
Okay, I didn't quite know that. Yeah, tell me more about this office, or like how would it be staffed by like congressmen and senators who say yes, no? Is it, Senate staff? Because I mean the executive part, where in OIRA and some of and in the agencies having people conscientiously think about how they would limit their own power as opposed to constantly aggrandizing it. That seems relatively straightforward. I don't know what the appetite within the administration is, but if you have a president who wants to, you could certainly do that. But the congressional thing piece is, to me at least, very interesting. So, like, who would be staffing a congressional regulation office, and
Yeah.
how would they? Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so you've hit upon an important point that I'll get your point in a second, which is the issue of incentives. And a lot of this sort of booklet, we think of ourselves as Madisonians and trying to create the incentives for these institutions to pursue it. You hit upon it. It's going to be hard sometimes for the executive branch to limit its own power. Now, on the one hand, the president, who might be skeptical about independent agencies or other federal agencies, might limit their power by reviewing them, but limiting the power of the executive branch has limited incentives. That's why we think Congress is particularly important. And the Congressional Regulatory Office, and it's not just our idea, this is an idea that has been floating out there for a number of years by a number of people. The version, as we conceive of it, would be something like the Congressional Budget Office. So the Congressional Budget Office is an institution which has accumulated functions over time. It's staffed, of course, by professionals, generally sort of career professionals that are hired by Congress to review things, and it produces a score, as people probably know, of budgetary expenditures, of how much something actually will cost. Okay, and they're now what we imagine is a congressional regulatory office that can do a couple of things. And I think to start with, it can be a receiving body so that there's some institution to receive advice from the executive branch. So the executive branch is like, what do you think about this regulation? Well, you can send it to an individual committee or a member, or the person who wrote the law, maybe, who's still there, and consult with them. But if there's a body of regulatory experts who are dedicated to that, hired by Congress and controlled as a legislative branch institution, they can review that and provide a congressional opinion that I think would be, they'd be incentivized to not hand out too much power to the executive branch. But I think over time, as the Congressional Regulatory Office develops credibility and reliability and institutional capacity, I think it could be like the Congressional Budget Office, relied upon as legislation is being developed, because it would be very valuable for members to, when they're producing statutes, to have an institution that can review the statute and say, hey, look at this language. They can drive a truck through this. You just said the secretary shall make all necessary regulations to preserve the health of the American people. Well, you've handed off too much. You've gone beyond what the Supreme Court believes should be generally delegated to the executive branch. And so having that check before the laws are written to tighten them up, that would also be extremely valuable, I think, in the long term.
Yeah, that's a very important. That makes sense. Is on you have it from both ends of the lawmaking and then the regulatory making, and sort of an institution that operates as like a pass through between both branches but within the congressional branch to protect its prerogatives and its constitutional powers. Let me ask one more question. You mentioned the incentives of the executive maybe not being there. What are the incentives from the legislative branch to reassume some of its lawmaking authority? Because one of the things that we've talked about on this podcast with some other guests about the administrative state is that, in fact, there's a benefit to the administrative state, which it takes the onus off of congressmen for having that responsibility of lawmaking. It's the Nancy Pelosi. We'll just find out what's in the bill once the regulatory agencies get to it, and they'll really be the ones making the law. So, what do you think of that?
Oh, I think that's a tremendously difficult problem. I think that on the one hand, you just need to sort of. There was a congressman from Virginia at one point, I forget, but he was a Democratic congressman, and he said, "Stop us before we spend again." Right? Stop, like I need some restraint on the spending, right? And I think stop us before we delegate again would be a great sort of mantra. It's not anything that's straightforward. There's a lot of internal rules, some of which go beyond what we talk about in the booklet about the way that Congress is organized. And a lot of people in Washington always say, there's workhorses and show horses, and you got to figure out ways to sort of really reward workhorses who are willing to legislate the finer details and not sort of pass it off and let that. And so having those sort of internal rewards in Congress, but then ultimately, a lot of this, there's no avoiding it. You can engineer things just like we've been engineering it since the beginning, and Madison tried to sort of engineer things. But if you read Madison carefully, he says, our principal reliance is on the people. Okay. And then we have all these other auxiliary precautions, but they're auxiliary. All the mechanics of the Constitution are auxiliary to the people. So the people would have to be doing things saying, hey, Congress, legislate. I've elected you to legislate. I want to reward my my congressman, my congresswoman who is working and doing these diligent details and asserting themselves. And I think that's civic education. There's a lot of elements, but it ultimately revolves back around the people demanding that each of the branches do their job, which is, in the case of Congress to legislate, but also doing their job to check the other branches. And because that's part of their job as well, is to check the other branches as well as to fulfill the prerogatives of their own.
Yeah, and that's civic education, something that ISI is, of course, intensely involved in and cares about deeply, is, having the proper civic education, because, we all learn these things, separation of powers, checks and balances. You throw these terms around, not you, but, we throw these terms around loosely without, I think, maybe giving enough attention to what they mean or how they are put into practice or not in today. And I think people have a sense of that, but maybe are not entirely sure
Yeah,
why things have gone so wrong.
it has to have that connection between the way that I think of it is to sort of draw that connection between your activities and your power as a citizen, your vote, your voice, and the long-standing issues of the Constitution. I mean, how many of us? I mean, maybe the two of us and some of the people listening to this are separate, but more broadly, how many people in America judge their congressional representative by saying, hey, are you fulfilling, you took an oath to the Constitution. How is that going? How are you fulfilling your constitutional role, and judge them for reelection based on their fidelity and their interpretation and their diligence towards the Constitution and towards their constitutional responsibilities. I think we look at them for entirely other reasons in terms of ideological compatibilities and how often they're on TV and how well they speak and how all of those, rather than those sort of what I think are fundamental criteria that citizens need to use.
That's a point well made, and a good question to ask ourselves, for the midterms or our municipal elections this year. We got to keep moving, though. The other big thing is federalism. and the relationship between the states and the federal government. And one of the proposals is to again take the major questions doctrine and apply it to the federal and state relationships. That looks different than what it would look like between the three federal branches, but could you describe that dynamic of the major questions as applied to the states and what that would look like if the government did that?
Yeah. So in a lot of cases, what the way that state and federal relations happen in a practical sense is financial. So the financial relationship between the states and the federal government operates through these programs, in particular through grants. And so one of the things that was highlighted, and this came up during our process of our research and in speaking to a lot of policy experts, is that conditions the federal government puts on grants and the way that it administers programs and the way that it puts incentives and bonuses and penalties towards the states within the way that it disperses funds, doesn't give it to you, doesn't give it to you without asking for various things, needs to be looked at carefully. And that when we look at imposing grant conditions on states, on recipients, and saying, okay, you can have the money, but only if you hire these kind of people, or if you give it in this way to these sort of people, or with these elements, is well beyond what the statute or the appropriations for the grants say. That needs to be looked at, because that's not what Congress said, and it's a way for simply federal agencies, unelected individuals within federal agencies, to actually manipulate whole states and get them and change the way that states are doing things. And we see this in areas like I worked in Health and Human Services. We see it in education grants and other areas. And so that kind of review should be done within agencies before they approve any grant conditions. What are you really promulgating here? Is this something that is, whether it's ideologically compatible or not, is it authorized? Do you really have the authority to impose that on the states? And the states should have the capacity and the incentive to be able to push back against those things too.
Yeah, could you maybe from your own experience at Health and Human Services give an example of what this kind of looks like in practice?
Yeah. So, there's a long sort of debate in a variety of areas and at HHS over waivers. So what can happen is you might, for instance, you might seek a waiver for your Medicaid money and say, there'll be more, on the more conservative side, that you want to impose work conditions, or Congress might have said, and that might, the question is that actually authorized by the statute? Now, again, I might like there to be work conditions, but that if Congress hasn't authorized within that in the program, that's a problem. And conversely, you might propose conditions on aid that favor various hiring practices or affirmative action practices and so on. And we see that in other areas as well. So, but the question, was that authorized by Congress?
Okay, and not only is it authorized by Congress, is there also a question about, is Congress in passing a law, overstepping its bounds, or is that a different sort of question to what you're talking about in this administrative capacity?
Yeah, that's a somewhat separate question. I mean, it's obviously a real it's a real question in that can Congress generally, and certainly with regard to spending, can impose conditions and direct it. The Congress has the power of the purse, but there are certainly times when Congress can and overstep its bounds. Its bounds are set by the Constitution, and you're talking about from the standpoint of federalism, that the Congress is constrained by the structural limitations. We have a limited federal government, it says so in the Constitution. Not everybody, not everybody watches that as carefully, but you certainly would want to look at a condition that might be built in by Congress that is a sort of a stealth way of manipulating the states. That they didn't want to pass an actual way, but they put certain conditions on that. And there are some Supreme Court limitations on that. The most famous one is Congress's conditioning highway aid for the raising of the drinking age, and that's in South Dakota versus Dole. And the Supreme Court has been fairly tolerant of Congress doing that. They put limitations at one point on the Affordable Care Act. They sort of like, this is going a little bit too far in terms of requiring these sort of Medicaid changes through the manipulation of money. So there is that limitation there. And I think that probably the states are the ones that are probably going to have to look for those and sue on those. But it would be great if the executive branch would also raise some questions if they thought that the Congress was violating federalism.
And just because we're short on time, I want to go to one other constitutional sort of question that you've raised in the booklet, which is on eminent domain. The prohibition, the authorization in one sense constitutionally of the government to take private property for public use, but not with the caveat, not without a just compensation. And I know there are other limits about, what counts as public use. So there's that sort of limitation, even as the power is enumerated. But one of the things you talk about is, protecting individual liberties from eminent domain abuse. So, how are people being abused by eminent domain? I've heard of some stories, but how it's been using eminent domain, and then how an executive change or a congressional change could protect people and their property rights. These are the things that we fought the revolution over.
Sure. So, again, we in this workshop, we incorporate a lot of feedback from active public interest lawyers who are concerned in these property rights areas. And one of the main issues is that when you get really into being a lawyer, right, it has to do with the process itself can be a punishment, and you need to have the appropriate remedies that are available to you. So even if you are able to ultimately to assert your constitutional rights in many of these eminent domain cases, you've already lost the land. The business has already been lost. You go and try to get it back, you really can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. So what we're really asking for in terms of due process from administrative agencies is, on the one hand, a review internally that suggests, hey, look at this, look at the constitutionality of what you're doing, look at the authorities before you take the property, before you impose the condition, rather than say, well, they can sue later. If we did wrong, you can sue later. Well, that really doesn't help the person, right? Suing the federal government, that's a big challenge, and it's years later. And then on the other side of it, we think that courts ultimately are the forum that can step in when a person is suing a government. The government, it's a big mismatch. The courts can be the great equalizer, but they can only be the great equalizer if you can take your case quickly to court, rather than have to work your way always through the administrative agency that's doing the thing to you, saying, no, don't do it, and appealing within their own process, because they're both the executive and the rule writer, the legislator, and the adjudicator in many cases over your case, until the very end when, after all your appeals have failed within the agency, you can go to court. If there's a way to get you to court earlier before it's too late for you, that is a much stronger protection for individual liberty. And that's one of the items that we talk about in the book.
Absolutely. I think it's a core constitutional principle that a man can't be the judge in his own case, but it also is amazing to hear what you just said, which is that the government claims eminent domain, takes the property, and acts on it while there's litigation against it. So by the time someone might get it back, they could have ripped up the business completely and transformed the land and then had it handed back to you. That's absolutely that's mind-boggling. I actually had no idea that that happened. Um, we're basically out of time, but I've got one more question, which is, based on the 2 weeks, President has, signed a number of executive actions and orders. I'm A, curious if he's done any of the things that you've proposed, and B, what you think he should do next.
Right. So the one of the things he's done is he this sort of odd thing. He rescinded a bunch of Biden administration executive orders, many of which rescinded many of his prior executive. So I think that works to reinstate a number of his regulatory control executive orders that we talk about here in the report, including creating a regulatory budget so that we look at the cost of regulations and that they're required to do that and be given a budget so you can't impose too high a cost from any agency from your regulations, and reinstating a rule that we're going to remove two regulations before we put a new one in there. Those appear to be reinstated, but I think many of the items that what we're looking to do are still there to be implemented. And really, this phase of the administration, this or very early phase, is about clearing the underbrush in a lot of ways. And the next phase, hopefully even within the next few months, will be about building up that some of the things that seem to be on offer, about saying, what kind of regulation will we have? We know we don't want to do what the prior administration did. We know we don't like a lot of their regulations, but what kind of regulations? Regulations that are firmly designed for the benefit of the American people as measured by cost-benefit analysis, for instance, just on a technical basis. Look, reasserting things like federalism, reasserting things like the regulations that you do right, you say explicitly, and you build in, you say they're not going to be beyond statutory authority. We're going to go do things like we're going to start reviewing the existing regulations to say which ones really stretch the boundaries. We're going to be able to evaluate. There's opportunities. I did it at HHS experimentally with artificial intelligence to examine the corpus of regulations and look for ones that seem to be stretching statutory authority, and sort of highlight and start examining those and looking to restore that proper balance by limiting the scope of those regulations that might have exerted authority beyond the statute in a way that seems incompatible today. I think that kind of regulatory review and these regulatory principles, and as well as the broader principles, to take it in line with the Constitution and say explicitly, this executive branch will function as the founders wanted the executive branch to function, and that's going to be a lodestar for us. I mean, making that explicit, I hope, will be what the next phase will look like.
As do I, Charles. I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and hearing about this report and how we can reform not only the administrative apparatus but bring it back into line with I think one of the main objectives of the 2024 campaign for President Trump was, we're going to fix the immigration crisis and just millions of people pouring over and inflation, but really the big one was the administrative state, the deep state, and restoring accountability and the power and the proper orientation of government as it was designed by the founders and demanded by the people of America. So if the president did a lot of the things that you wrote in the report, I think that'd be a great thing. So thanks again for joining me. If there are places where people can find more of your work or stay up to date with what you're doing and how these things are going, where would you recommend they look?
Well, of course, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Twitter. I'm not a regular, or X, sorry. I'm not a regular Xer, Twitter, but I do post things that I publish there on Twitter. I just recently wrote an article in The Hill on the return to work issue, So you'll be able to see my work if you follow me there.
Well, fantastic. And thanks again, Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.